Okay, today I'm going to show you how to add a feature in our backend APIs to detect whether a HTTP request was submitted via an HTML form or with JavaScript. If we look here, we have a very basic event handler for a Nuxt.js server. It generates an object and then returns that object, and because it's returning an object, that object is going to be sent to the response as JSON. Now, it doesn't matter that we're using Nuxt.js here. What matters is if this event handler receives an HTTP request from a form, it's going to return JSON to that form, and the HTML is not really going to know what to do with that, and so the browser is just going to render that as a JSON string. What would be a lot nicer is if our request handler detects whether a request was submitted with an HTML form, and in that case, just redirect back to the same page it came from. But if it was submitted with JavaScript, then go ahead and return the JSON. Fortunately, there's an HTTP header called sec_fetch_mode, which browsers are going to automatically include with every HTTP request, whether it's through an HTML form or through JavaScript. And this header can help us distinguish which one was used to make the request. Now, there's a number of values available, but the one that we're interested in is navigate, because that is the one that will be sent if the HTTP request was submitted via HTML form and it's not allowed to be sent with a fetch request. So here's how our logic may change. We can grab the headers off the request object. Then if we see that sec_fetch_mode is set to navigate, we know that this was submitted with HTML. If the request was submitted with HTML, it doesn't make sense to return JSON. So instead, we can send a 303 redirect back to the browser. In some cases, you may know where you want to send that redirect, but in the case that you don't know, it might make sense just to send it back to the page that it came from. And you can do that by grabbing the referrer header off of the headers object. Now, this is great, but there's just one problem. This actually isn't cross-browser compatible because Safari doesn't currently support it, and this won't be supported in older browsers. Fortunately, we can fix that by making a couple different adjustments. So since we can't tell with certainty that a request came in with HTML, it makes more sense to swap the logic around and try and determine whether the request came in with JavaScript, and then in that case, send the JSON back, and if not, default to sending a redirect. There's a few different ways to determine if a request was made with JavaScript. For example, we could check if the accept header is included in the request, and that way the client could explicitly ask for JSON as a response. Or we can check whether the content type was modified and explicitly set to application JSON. In that case, we can assume that the request was sent with JavaScript because while HTML forms can modify the content type, they can't explicitly set it to JSON, so we can assume that it was sent with JavaScript. And the last option is to check for a custom HTTP header because forms cannot add these custom headers to a request. So we know that if it was customized to be added in the request object, then it must have been done so through fetch. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, that's kind of cool, but why should I care about doing this? Progressive enhancement allows developers to build applications that are enhanced to use JavaScript when they can, but if something happens where JavaScript fails or it's blocked or whatever, it can fall back to using the form to submit a request. So by building APIs that enable progressive enhancement, developers can build progressive enhanced apps. So let me just show you how this works in action. On this page, I have an HTML form that by default is going to submit using just the HTML form. So when I hit the submit button, we see that we get the API response, we get a 303 redirect response, which reloads the page. But if I enable this to be submitted with JavaScript and I submit that button, we see that in the response object, we get the JSON that we would expect. So we can go ahead and do something with JavaScript in a nice progressive enhanced way. So it's important to point out that all of these methods require checking for headers that are not sent by default with a standard fetch request, which means you're going to want to be explicit in your documentation to tell developers that they're going to have to manually add these headers to their fetch requests when they make those requests if they want to receive JSON back. At least that'll only be the case until browser support gets better and we can rely exclusively on sec_fetch mode. So as one last little tip, I just want to share that this logic we have here is actually a perfect sort of candidate for something like edge workers. So you can add this to your API without even having to modify your own backend code.